want some coffee or cookies or anything in the middle, just go up and get it, feel free. And my years playing coffee houses, I'm a great believer. Anybody who feels they need some sugar or caffeine during my performance, I want them to have it. As Terry said, it's book revival. It's actually, the full title is Revival, a Folk Music Novel. As far as I know, it's the first novel that's entirely set in the folk music world, about two very different songwriters drawn together by their shared passion for the music at very different times in their lives. And each kind of mentors the other in some very important ways. In fact, there was a line that was so important to me as a guide for the themes of the book that, although it doesn't appear in the book, I put it on the cover. And that line is, "We come of age more than once." And it's very much about these two comings of age that each of the two songwriters has during the process of the book. The older guy is named Nathan Warren. He hosts an open mic and a jam session at a seedy little eccentric neighborhood bar in North Cambridge called Dooley's. And he is a guy who should have been a star, not just, you know, like everybody who starts to play guitar thinks they should be a star. He actually signed a major label deal. He made the album. He was the guy everybody thought was going to be the big star, but the album was never released for reasons that had nothing to do with him or his talent or his music, which destroyed him both personally and professionally. Sadly, that's a story that has happened in real life to many very promising artists. So he's just coming out of years of drinking and depression as the book begins, and he's kind of resigned himself that he just missed, and he's a failure, but at least he's still a musician. And he meets a young, very charismatic, very smart, very talented, great songwriter named Kit Palmer, a young woman who's having what she refers to as her precocious midlife crisis in her late 20s, because she doesn't think she needs to figure out what she's going to do and decides she's going to be a songwriter. Problem is, she can't get through an entire song on stage. She has just paralyzing stage fright and nerves and jitters and things. That brings them together, but as I said, pretty soon I think she's mentoring him more than he is. Give me an idea of the sort of the atmosphere of the book. I think of it as a love story within a love story. It's a love story about these two songwriters, but it's also, I was very aware that this world, this very vibrant grassroots music world, had never really been captured in fiction before. So I wanted to kind of take the reader on a tour of that world, from little bars like Dooley's to big folk festivals like the Falcon Ridge and major concert halls and little basement recording studios. There's a very important scene at a coffee house, very much like the One World Coffee House, where I was first contacted to come here, and a scene at a house concert, another very important scene at a house concert. So I really wanted to show the world, the folk world as it exists today, very vibrant community, grassroots music. So this passage, what I'm going to do is lead up to this song that is mentioned, and then I'll sing the song, and then I'll finish the reading, give you an idea. This gives you kind of an idea of Nathan. Whatever Nathan Warren thinks he's doing, whatever he thinks he's thinking about, he's really always kind of thinking about the music. He's really sort of always inside the music. So Kit Palmer, in addition to being a songwriter, also grew up playing fiddle, and she's playing fiddle at the back room of the Jam, and he goes to see how she's doing. This happens very early in the book. Nathan walked down the back hallway, up a short flight of stairs, and into a large rectangular room with something fuzzy on the floor that probably used to be a carpet. There were about 50 people there, divided into several jams, each with a handful of musicians and a few people just listening. Dim overhead lighting cast a yellowish glow on everything, like a lamplit room in an old house. Kit sat with a half-dozen jammers at a small table by the far end of the room. They had finished a tune and were laughing and talking in the time-honored way of the jam. Applause is considered bad form because it suggests a performance atmosphere. So after a tune, there's a period of idle chatter, sipping beers, laughing and shuffling chairs, until somebody begins another tune. There is an unspoken order to all this, but nobody really knows what it is. It's simply the way it's always been, since the first caveman noticed his neighbor beating on a rock, wandered over and said, "Hey, I got a stick too." A young guitarist in a faded Boston Celtics jersey, neatly trimmed beard stubble, and Martin guitar baseball cap, suddenly began to sing a traditional cowboy song, Colorado Trail. Nathan walked closer, putting a finger over his lips, when a few people started to say hi. He wanted to listen. Eyes like a morning star, cheeks like a rose. Laura was a pretty girl, everybody knows. Weep all ye falling rains, whale winds wail, all along the Colorado Trail. Ride through the lonely night, ride through the day, keep that herd moving on its way. Weep all ye falling rains, whale winds wail, all along the Colorado Trail. Ride through the stormy night, dark is the sky. Wish I'd stayed in that valley where it's mighty warm and dry. Weep all ye falling rains, whale winds wail, all along the Colorado Trail. Face like a prairie flower, laughing all the day. Laura was a pretty girl, now she's gone away. Weep all ye falling rains, whale winds wail, all along the Colorado Trail. All along the Colorado Trail. All along You could almost hear the slow padding of horses and cattle in the easy gait of the song. It vaguely tells a story about a pretty girl named Laura, whom the cowboy loves and misses. But the song never explains who she is or what's happened to her. She's simply gone away. As a young man, that drove Nathan crazy. He tried to learn the song a few times, but without knowing what happened to Laura, or even what her relationship was to the cowboy, he didn't know how to approach it. Now he thought those omissions were brilliant, because the song really isn't about Laura, or even the lovelorn cowboy. It's simply about being alone in a lonely place and wishing that you weren't. Nathan certainly knew what that felt like. Bobbing his head lightly to the beat, Nathan closed his eyes and wondered what it was about sad songs that appeal to us so much. Do we like being sad? Even the up-tempo songs at the Jam were usually about train wrecks, dead mothers, ghastly murders, and ghostly lovers walking these hills in long, black veils. Maybe it's like those actors who say they prefer playing villains because they're more interesting. Our dark feelings have more complex palettes, at least in art they do. But Nathan had learned that form usually follows function in traditional music. Perhaps our unhappy feelings are more in need of examining than our happy ones. Who needs to solve happiness? We need to understand the dark sides of life. That's where the dangers are. Why else would cowboys have sung all those sad love songs? It was the one time they could display their inner selves, explore their feelings, and share them with friends. And those deeper feelings need attention, even on a cattle drive. Leave them alone too long, unexamined and unexpressed, and they fester like an untreated wound. Maybe that's why Colorado Trail leads us away from the particulars about Laura and the cowboy. Laura becomes everybody's absent love, and the cowboy's loneliness becomes everybody's loneliness. And doesn't the simple act of sharing that in a song make us a little less lonely? So as you can see, another thing that I really wanted to do with revival, and this is very much what to me is great about folk music today. I didn't want this just to be a book about the music business, about people being stars or not being stars, as if that was the sum of the reason that music exists, that humans invented music. I wanted it to be a book about the love of music that we all have, and what it is about music that can, you know, the mystery of listening to a 150-year-old, 180-year-old cowboy song and have it take us so deeply into our own most intimate emotions from somebody who lived such a very different life than we did. And that, I think, really is one of the saving graces of Nathan in the book, and certainly one of the things that brings Nathan and Kit together, something that they very much share, is this mystical awe of the power of music. And what I mean by saying it's very much what folk music is about today, I think folk music, its mission has always been, I think, to be a real people's music, to be about us. At one point, Nathan reflects that it's sort of the mission of folk music to make, as he puts it, our most ordinary mornings the stuff of song. And it's so different from what pop music is today, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything except buying things. But even though this is very much a contemporary novel, I couldn't resist, as I was saying to some of you earlier, after covering folk music for so long and being in it for so long, there are these stories that, a lot of them were great stories that I would hear after interviews, that I couldn't slip into the stories, you know, but true stories about folk that say so much about the music, because I think it's the people in folk music, even more than in other music forms. It's the people that really drive it. And so let me share one of those with you about a blues legend from the 1960s. Bless you. For weeks, Nathan had been, thank you so much for doing it between readings. very, very thoughtful of you. And particularly not during the song. For weeks, no, feel free. It's the sounds of real life. That's what folk music is all about. For weeks, Nathan had been jotting down his favorite stories about folk music. Not necessarily the most important ones, but the fun ones, the odd, mysterious, and revealing ones. The ones that felt like secrets. There was a story he'd heard about the old Texas blues legend Lightnin' Hopkins. He had a few minor R&B hits in the 40s, right around the time rhythm and blues was getting its name. What Hopkins took away from the experience more than anything was that he should never trust a white man with a pen in his hand. And so the story goes, one fine day Lightnin' found his cupboards bare. It was the dawn of the 60s folk revival, and several small record labels had expressed interest in recording him again. He always said no, but now he needed the money. He got in his car and drove to New York, the Big Apple, Gotham, the city so nice they named it twice. Arriving at one of the labels, he told them he would record for them, but he would not sign anything and would not accept a check. Cash only, one payment, and a bottle of gin. Of course, the right thing would have been to say, "Oh no, Mr. Hopkins, that will cost you a lot of money. Think of the royalties, sir." But the label would get to keep those royalties, so they scurried to the bank and came back with a few $1,000s in a big brown envelope and a bottle of gin. He opened both, put one in his pocket, the other in his mouth, and sang them 12 songs, all in 1 or 2 takes. "Everybody happy?" he said when he was through. Everybody nodded, so he left, got in his car, checked his address book, and drove to the next label that had asked about recording. He made them the same proposition, got the same deal, and, drinking their gin and stuffing their big envelope in his pocket, sang them the same song. He repeated this process with 5 or 6 other labels over the next few days, then drove home to Houston and restocked his cupboards. Nathan didn't know if the story was true, but he hoped it was. He did know there were a curious number of Lighton and Hopkins records from the early 60s that featured different versions of the same songs. I have, since this book came out, one of the wonderful things about folk music is the audiences that come, the people that you meet. And Gordon Bach, the great Maine folk singer, is convinced that folk audiences collectively know everything that there is to be known. And if there is anything you want to know, just go on tour, ask 3 or 4 coffee house audiences, somebody in the back will know. But since this book came out, I've heard from 2 different very reliable sources that that story was true. Pretty much the way it was supposed to be. I also wanted to show, here maybe get to some of the things that might interest you a little bit as a writer. I wanted to show, I think one of the great advantages of fiction, one of the reasons that I wanted to write a novel about folk music, is that you can get deeper inside the process of being a musician, deeper inside the not only the wonder of music, but the process of making music, creating arrangements, and writing songs, which of all the art forms I've dabbled in, songwriting is the most dependent on the whims of inspiration. And sometimes you'll hear a songwriter say, it took me 5 years to write this song. It doesn't mean that they spent 5 years writing at it every day. It means that they wrote 1 verse and were stumped for 2 years. Then they came up with a chorus, and then they were stumped for 2 more years. And just sort of waiting for the song to come. And so I wanted to show that. Nathan thinks that that part of his life is over. He's resigned himself that the creative, artistic fire part of his life is over. But then he meets Kit, and he falls in love, and you know, all kinds of things come back to life, don't they? So this is how the song comes to him, and sort of shows how he begins to process that. Nathan was sweeping the kitchen floor, humming quietly to the slow swish of the broom. He stopped suddenly, realizing he was remembering the melody to an old unfinished song. He hadn't thought of it in years, but always meant to finish it someday. Why had it come back to him now? He walked into the living room, picked up his guitar, and sang the first 2 lines. Make me well, someone break the spell that's kept me down since first I fell. He sang it again and laughed, remembering the self-pitying lament he tried to write after that opening couplet. Pompous young twit. He hadn't even liked the girl who inspired it. He just hadn't liked the idea of her dumping him. It had been nothing but vanity, pure, foolish vanity. No wonder he couldn't finish it. It wasn't true. Maybe that's why it came back to him after all these years. Maybe he'd grown up enough to know what to write after those first 2 lines. He felt a faint tickle of inspiration, a strange feeling that ideas were forming into words in that place beneath our conscious thoughts. He'd always liked the melody and felt it had something to say. There must be some reason it returned to him today, but it had been such a long time since he'd written anything. The old fear flashed through him. What makes you think you can relight the old dead fires of inspiration? Keep them cold. They're safer that way. They can't burn. But then he thought about Kit during those nor'easters, alone and hurt, wondering what she had done to drive him away and writing that beautiful new song, turning her feelings inward and then outward to the way we all feel when winter makes us seem so alone in the world. He tentatively touched the guitar as if it was something strange and new in his arms. His fingers faltered and fluttered from the strings. He was afraid. It had been so long, so long. But then he realized he was feeling something different, more recent. Not the familiar specters of cold ash and dead ember, the memory of wood. It did not bring the familiar pain, but something that tingled excitedly, expectantly beneath the fear. What was it? He smiled and caught his breath. Oh, that. He realized that his fingers felt on the strings the way they had at the first touch of Kit's soft skin the first time they made love. How his hands had fluttered and faltered on her shoulders and along her arms and back. And how she'd smiled at him, warmly, safely, and leaned into his hands until they found their firmness. He closed his eyes, keeping that smile inside him, and began to play. He pressed his fingers down until the old sureness returned. And then after he writes for a little while, I don't always share this, but since there's so many writers here, because I think the writers will relate to this, he says, it's one of the hardest things for the songwriter to do, and the most important, completely useless discipline for a journalist working at a daily newspaper, I can tell you. But, and that is knowing when you're starting to hurt it, knowing when you have to stop, and you have to let it incubate, you have to let it breathe, you know, and leave it until it calls you back. Is that enough for today? Let it breathe a while, incubate. It's an amazing thing about songs. You can leave them alone, then return to find that they've made progress on their own, like they're living things. And then suddenly they seem to have their own energy. Nathan used to call it the Pinocchio moment, when the piece of wood comes to life. From that moment on, a song participates in its own creation. That's when you know you've got a real song, and you know it viscerally. It's euphoric, like the best rush from the best drug in God's own pharmacy. At another point, he has a line just come to him, just charge through him like an electric shock. And he doesn't even know if he wrote it. It came so fully formed, and at the end he's just enjoying the feeling, because it's like I'm sure some of you have had it, because it's like a physical sensation, sort of like the way you feel after an electric shock. This kind of mixture of ache and elation, it's something that's physically passed through you. And that passage ends with that nobody knows where these things come from or how they happen. The ancients used to call it the muse because they didn't know what the hell it was either. Does anybody have anything that they want to ask or add, or I want to feel free to make this as conversational? Yeah.
I find myself wondering, because I don't know the exact time frame of the novel, where Bob Dylan is in this. Is he a meteor who starts out with Woody Guthrie songs and becomes this extremely popular creative genius? Is he outside the realm of the story arc?
Well, he's not in the book. I mean, it's a novel. So,
well, I know, but is he part?
Much, but Woody Guthrie, actually, there's a very important scene where you sort of consider the different things that the older Nathan Warren and the young Kit Palmer, that they draw very different things from Woody. That he's always been very struck by Woody's outspoken radicalism and his ability to articulate that poetically. She's very drawn by how intimately he experiences everything he talks about. And she looks at him and sort of wrinkles her nose like it might be the wrong answer, you know, and she says it almost feels like they're all love songs. And he realizes that she's right and that he's never really thought about it, but that's his real power, is that he humanized everything so much and he made it all so human. But Dylan very much took from the Woody Guthrie tradition, and when, in fact, when he first got to Greenwich Village, he described, well, years later, he described himself as being a Woody Guthrie jukebox.
Yeah.
And he I mean, it wasn't just the songs, it was the hair, the dress, the mannerisms. He held his cigarettes the same way that Woody did in pictures. He ingratiated himself into Woody's hotel or hospital room, and then went to Greenwich Village and said he was an old friend of Woody's that was just into town, and stuff. But he's very much a part of he's the link in that tradition going forward.
I guess I'm wondering if the older generation is of the 60s, and if the meeting time with the younger generation is past the 60s. Is it is your novel placed in a particular decade?
It's sort of in a it's contemporary, but it's sort of, I don't know if there's a literary, maybe somebody here knows if there's a literary term for when you set up sort of a permanent contemporary state, so that it's contemporary now, and hopefully in 20 years somebody will pick it up and still feel it's a contemporary novel. And this goes backwards with this too. I was talking to some people earlier that there are people whose experience with open mics and jam sessions and folk music on that level was in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s, who swear that the book is from that era.
Okay.
There are people who have read the book and absolutely are convinced that it's from the 60s, even though there are cell phones and computers that play pretty important roles in the book.
Yeah.
But they just sort of, you know, it's the thing that's great about fiction is that your imagination plays such a role, and your memory becomes a co-writer. So
yeah.
That's what people see. I mean, one of the nicest things anybody wrote about Tom Paxton, the great songwriter from the 60s, wrote about revival. It very much reminded him of his days starting out in Greenwich Village, and he said, really just shuffle a few tables and chairs around and you've got it.
Yeah.
So part of that is just that because folk music exists as such a human tradition. I mean, what I see is that, you know, Woody Guthrie picked that tradition up from the people who taught him and from the traditional songs he learned growing up in Okemo, Oklahoma. And Dylan picked that tradition up from Woody, as Pete Seeger did.
Right.
And then other people picked that tradition up from Dylan. I'll tell you a great story that I think is really an example of what tradition means in a human way, not this sort of abstract way, but in a living way. Bill Morrissey, any of you familiar with Bill Morrissey?
Yes.
Great New Hampshire songwriter and novelist who wrote a book in which the main character was called Edson, great book. The main character is a songwriter. But he told me that he went to the Newport Folk Festivals in the early 60s. He just discovered Dylan and he wanted to be Dylan, right? So he goes to the Newport Folk Festival and he just follows Dylan around. That's all he wants to do is just follow Dylan around. And he gets to this workshop and he's on the stage with 3 or 4 other people. And Bill Morrissey is just staring at Dylan, and then during the song by this old black guy, he realizes that, you know, Dylan has leaned over in his chair, and he's just staring at this guy's hands on the guitar as he sings. And so he looks at that, and his eyes follow that over. He looks back at Dylan, he looks at the old black guy, he looks back at Dylan, and the way Morrissey told the story, he said, that was my light bulb moment. I said, wait a minute, if I want to sing like that cat, I shouldn't be listening to that cat. I should be listening to that cat. I should be listening to the cat that cat's stealing from. And that guy was Mississippi John Hurt.
Oh, yeah.
So Morrissey immersed himself, and his primary influence as a guitarist and songwriting stylist was Mississippi John Hurt. So that's how the tradition works, always moving backward and forward at the same time. Yeah. And that's very much why the book is called Revival. It's an exploration of what revival and tradition are, that this evolving sense, both personally and in connection with the music, of what revival means and what tradition means, and that Nathan sees that revival is something that's always happening. It's not something that just occasionally happens. It's the way a tradition breathes. It's always breathing in what's the new air around it, and whatever's sustaining and useful, it ingests, and whatever's wasteful and ephemeral, it exhales and spits out. And generation after generation can look and use that as a benchmark for what's real and lasting in art. You know, because like the folk songs that were turned into folk rock songs in the 60s are still there. And what you look at is you see the ones that sound the most 60s, the arrangements, are the ones that seem the most dated. You know, the people who did the songs just straight ahead, those are the ones that last, because the songs always last.
For instance, like who? Like
well, I think of you know, Joan Baez her early stuff. I mean, it could have been released yesterday. It's when she starts getting into country rock a little bit, and into songwriting, that her stuff starts to sound to me a little more dated. And I think like the Byrds, their versions of traditional songs like John Riley and Wild Mountain Thyme stand up really well because as much as they were a rock band, the song always wins. You know, when the song never gets bent to the arrangement. It's always what they're doing within the song. And I think of all the folk rock bands back then, I think the one that stands up the best is Steel Ice Band, British band, because they were always it was just all about the song, you know. And
but it's true, certainly so many artists. I mean, you look at like Willie Nelson, and his stuff is always fresh.
Yeah.
And he goes way back.
He's old,
way
yes,
back.
exactly. He's always going back to both his own roots and to the roots of his form, and replenishing. John Lennon once said that if he could pass a law, he would, that everybody who makes money playing rock and roll has to sing Bebop-A-Lula at least once every 6 weeks, just to remind themselves what business they're in. And that was a real guide for me in my writing. Let me do a song here and show you. I mean, I hadn't written fiction before. I wrote revival. But I'd been a journalist for over 20 years for what was then a very good paper. Don't get me started. And it was a real writer's paper. They really prided themselves on that, which meant that when they edited me, it was for clarity. And every time I got challenged by an editor, I learned more about writing. You know, because it wasn't just, they never challenged me for content or for judgment or anything. It was always, you know, this sentence, I'm assuming you mean it this way, but it could be read this way. And so they were always trying to get me to say things in a way that transferred my thought accurately to the reader. And it was all about the reader. And I'd been a songwriter and a student of traditional songs. And it struck me that the two alloys of songwriting with its poetry and music and journalism with its clarity and brevity, it wasn't a bad combination to create a compound of novel. And I really looked a lot at, well, this song, I happened to be learning when I was trying to figure out how to use landscape and description. And my thoughts about it, what this song taught me, very simple little song from colonial America, from very early America. What it taught me was so important to me that I actually ended up using it in the book. And in fact, it's divided up into 2 books, book 1 and book 2, and they're both book 1 and book 2 are named from lines from this song. This song has the distinction of being so sad that the Irish stole it from us. A rare feather in our cap. Down in some lone hollow, in a lonesome place, where the wild birds all whistle, their sounds do increase. Farewell, pretty Sarah, I must bid you adieu, and I'll dream of pretty Sarah wherever I go. My love, she won't have me, and I understand. She wants a rich merchant, and I have no land. I cannot maintain her, I've no silver and gold. Buy her the fine things that a big house will hold. were a merchant and could write a fine hand, I would write my love a letter that she'd understand. I'd ride it by the river where the waters overflow, and I'll dream of pretty Sarah wherever I go. I'd ride it by the river where the waters overflow, and I'll dream of pretty Sarah wherever I'll dream of pretty Sarah wherever.
What's going on.
Yeah, yeah.
Just in the color of the language, how do you avoid redundancy in the language about how they feel about
each
each
other.
other?
I see, yeah.
Am I making myself
Absolutely,
clear?
yeah, yeah, and I think especially with love, it is a great question.
Because it can become really sort of, oh, okay, yeah, we know they love each other by now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think that I think there's three little points. One, that's the perfect example of where the writer's axiom, show don't tell, comes in. You don't talk about how much they love each other and how I didn't even know I was doing it. But he said, and this is something I say to singers all the time. If you're not sure about the phrasing of a line, speak it.
Yeah.
Talk it to the chords, accompany to the chords, but say it in your own voice. And you'll find where within your own speaking voice you can elongate a vowel or truncate a word to fit the melody. You'll find a way to do it within your own natural inflections in your own voice, which you can transpose that same thing to writing pretty easily.
But you do have to know how to do that. I mean, you have to begin somewhere. I mean, you have to know how to draw in order to not draw. I mean,
Yeah.
you have to learn at the beginning, sort of, a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, yeah, and to me, it's always about just telling a story, and just telling it as simply as you can.
But I thought Dylan didn't feel like he had a good voice. He just said, it's my voice.
Yeah.
I thought when I saw his autobiography, I thought I heard him say that. He's like, it was my voice.
Yeah. Well, it's
And
very.
I don't necessarily have a good voice, but it's mine.
Yeah. The voice that he built
Yeah.
was a very conscious affectation, and he's been very, especially in recent years, he's been very transparent, very about how deliberate it was, and it was three different parts. His singing voice, because he didn't think he did have an interesting voice. He wanted to be interesting. And that's the most poisonous influence to Bob Dylan, I think, has been the notion that to be an artiste, you have to appear interesting. But experience tells me that the more people try to appear interesting, the less likely that they are. You know? But anyway, he built his voice from the beat poets, and that very exaggerated way, I went to the store today, the way that sing-songy kind of way, because he said it made it so clear that it was all about the meaning of the words. And then there was Woody Guthrie and the old-time Appalachian singers, and the way they drawled and were so mysterious when they sang. And then it was Liam Clancy, of the Clancy brothers, who was the finest ballad singer that he'd ever heard, and he's ever heard, and so it was this combination of trying to tell a story and to have these affectations that put the focus on the words and that made him seem mysterious. I had the enormous privilege one night of getting really drunk with William Clancy. And boy, there's a lot I regret about my drinking days, but I'm glad I was still drinking when I boy, what a great thing it was. And at one point, I was kind of nervous about asking him, but what the heck, and I asked him how, Dylan always cites him as his primary vocal influence. So I asked Liam how he felt about that. And he said, well, I've always been kind of a two-minded. And I said, really, how so? And he said, well, it's a great honor. And, it's Bobby Dylan, and he says it all the time. Yeah, so what's the other side? He said, well, Jesus, have you heard the man sing? Would you want to be taking the blame for that?
that voice that Dylan put on in the 80s after everyone recognized it, after he had made his voice, it was almost like, okay, my voice, what you think my voice is. Okay, try this, sucker.
Yeah. And then he tried, and then every once in a while, for some reason, he would just sing something as well as he could. And you'd go, my God, whenever he wants to, he can really sing well. Why would he want to sing?
In Boston, and he was just unintelligent.
Yeah. Then he'll turn around and do something, a tribute for Pete or something like that, and he'll sing, and he can sing just beautifully. I mean, as beautifully as he can. Well, you asked for another song. Oh, well, This is about what we were talking about before, about my mom being a folk singer, so it's sort of ode I wrote to her.
Settlers who came with their cattle and grain, gold mines, long wagon trains. Oh, but it's still clean out there, she'd say, pure mountain air blows all your worries away. Sing me home, Carolina moon, home to your big Montana sky. Have your home in the prairie soon. Fare thee well, Carolina. went away, and I'd strike it, oh, I'd strike it big someday soon. Said then I'll buy you your home in Montana, just you, my Caroline. She kissed me and smiled, said good luck and goodbye, told me she had all she knew. Ah, but now and then I knew that she hoped I'd come through to bring her her Montana smile. Sing me home, Carolina, home to your big Montana sky. You'll have your home in the prairie soon. Fare thee well, Carolina. Fare thee well, Carolina.
That was beautiful.
Yeah. Scott's has some books back there if anybody's interested.
And some CDs too. Books are 20, CDs are 15.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.